It's been 13 years since I was officially insulin resistant, and I still remember every way that it felt. I remember eating carbohydrates and just putting on weight really easily. I remember eating a meal and then instantly feeling foggy. I remember my joints hurting. I remember the sleepless nights. I remember the night sweats. I remember all of that stuff. And it's so deeply rooted that over the last 13 years of fine-tuning and learning so much about insulin resistance, I could really figure out what was working and what wasn't. So let's jump right into it. The first thing that I really learned is that inflammation is at the root of insulin resistance. And the moment that I learned that, it changed everything, because I used to think it was purely a carbohydrate thing. And please don't get me wrong, carbohydrates play a role. When your metabolism is broken, the carbs just do not work well. But what I remember is that I would try so many things and ultimately just trying to restrict carbs to the point where I would do ultimately unhealthy things and I would become more inflamed, right? I'd stress my body. Although it's a little bit vague at first, just remember that the root of insulin resistance is inflammation. It's an inflammatory condition where your body has so much inflammation that you're not able to receive the signal from insulin. So you're not able to process carbohydrates well. The goal is when you get the inflammation under control, you can have the carbs again and your body will function well. A lot of people feel so good without them, they never go back to the carbohydrates. And quite frankly, I feel better oftentimes without them anyway. The second thing is carnosine. It blocks the catalyst of what is called an advanced glycation in products. So what I learned is that glycation, where carbohydrates and sugars mix with proteins or mix with fats and go through what's called glycation. But I learned that that is a major contributor to insulin resistance because it drives up oxidative stress and inflammation. So the reason that you're feeling funky, the reason you're feeling foggy, the reason you're feeling achy, the reason even your joints hurt is because you have this high degree of glycation and oxidative stress. Carnosine blocks the very root of glycation. So it's one of those things where quite literally 4 to 6 grams of carnosine per day was a game changer for me. And a lot of other people that watch my channel have said it's made a tremendous difference for them. So a simple, low-hanging fruit. The third thing, I learned that insulin resistance starts in the muscle. It's so easy for us to think that this is purely just this pathological thing that's happening at an organ level. My pancreas is broken, period, right? That's how I totally thought, point blank. But what we've learned is that so much of it starts in the muscle. And we've learned that the muscle is more of a signaling organ. It's an organ that has metabolic function, that sends out signals and tells the body and the brain to do different things. It communicates with the organs. So if we resistance train, if we train the muscles, if we stress the muscles, it begins a feedback loop that allows insulin resistance to start to ease up. And for so long, I just did cardio. And people do that. They'll just do cardio because they want to get the weight off. But that's just scratching one of the itches. The other major itch is actually restoring the organ that helps insulin resistance go away in the first place. The next thing I learned is that certain nutrient deficiencies and mineral deficiencies can increase insulin resistance more. Recently, I learned the importance of calcium when it comes down to insulin sensitivity. Your body essentially has certain minerals and vitamins that it needs to get in. Calcium is very important, right? So if you start becoming deficient in these things, it's going to increase appetite until you get those nutrients in. So this happens with certain micronutrients we're starting to uncover, but we've seen in literature that it's definitely the case with calcium. I started to make really big changes of my insulin resistance when I would consume more healthy dairy, when I would consume more good quality aged cheeses, when I would consume heavy cream. I wouldn't go overboard on it, but I was getting adequate amounts. It changed my appetite and it changed my insulin sensitivity. Not to mention there's really good things like conjugated linoleic acid that's in these healthy dairy fats. So don't be afraid of them. They actually could be what you need to help reduce some of the insulin resistance. The fifth thing I learned, and this is something that I really had a hard time understanding, was that fats at the wrong time and in the wrong place are problematic, but mainly only when they're combined with carbohydrates, right? So high amounts of trans fats, high amounts of saturated fats, these can trigger what are called these like mitochondrial traffic jams, right? So you're having so much carbs and so much fat coming in at once that the mitochondria doesn't know how to partition these. It's a substrate abundance issue. So much fat, so much carbs coming in. So what do you do with this? Well, the simplest thing is you separate them out. You don't have fats and carbs at the same time if you can avoid it. Now, a little bit's fine, the overlap that you would naturally get from a meal, but when you're talking like the standard American diet, high sugar, high saturated fat, that's where things are problematic. And yes, high amounts of saturated fat can trigger more insulin resistance, although it's less common to happen in someone that's very low carb or someone that's carnivore because you're not having additional impetus. But if you're eating a traditional amount amount of carbohydrates and you increase your saturated fat intake, you can definitely end up triggering more of your insulin resistance because you're essentially blocking some of the insulin receptor, and some of that lipid situation can cause an issue. It's nothing to freak out about. You just need to partition your macronutrients a little bit better. When I did that, everything fell into place. The sixth thing, I learned to induce GLP-1 with certain foods. For example, allulose. Allulose doesn't just help with your appetite. It stimulates GLP-1, which definitely helps with your appetite. But you gotta remember, the reason that GLP-1 receptor agonists are popular right now isn't because they were first discovered for appetite suppression. They were first used for insulin modulation and for glucose control. So their root is actually in helping insulin resistance. So when you eat foods that induce GLP-1 and things like allulose, which are demonstrated to strongly produce GLP-1, well, then these are things that are helping with insulin dynamics and then helping appetite sort of downstream of that. So once I got a grasp on that and I sort of realized that this is not about appetite suppression, it's about glucose modulation, I started using allulose, I started eating more protein, I started having high amounts of soluble fiber in one serving just to kind of induce that response, and I saw a major difference in my glucose. The seventh thing is I learned that the microbiome plays such a strong position when it comes to insulin resistance. The microbiome isn't just about helping you digest. It's sending signals to ultimately allow for glucose metabolism. So these short-chain fatty acids that are produced when we digest, when we break down fibers, when we break down certain foods, this influences glucose homeostasis. It's very important. In fact, it's more than important, it's critical to take care of the gut microbiome and the gut mucosal layer because it truly does begin there. If that is out of whack, watch what happens with your insulin resistance and watch what happens with your glucose. That's one of the reasons why people suggest that maybe even a low-carb diet is actually beneficial for insulin resistance. It's not just that you're reducing the carbohydrates, it's that a lot of times you're reducing some of the noise in the gut, allowing the microbiome to be a little bit better. Adding a probiotic in is usually really darn good too, so I put a link to the one that I recommend. It's called Seed. That is a daily symbiotic. I definitely recommend that one, and I've noticed a pretty significant change myself for the last 4 or 5 years of using it. But a lot of people that watch my channel will comment in the comment section and say they noticed a big difference in their glucose after adding a good probiotic in. So the technology with Seed is really fascinating. I find it very interesting how they're using that capsule inside of a capsule technology. I think it's something that would really help you. I think if you're battling with it and you're looking for that next little edge, this might be something that not only helps you maybe with your appetite and how you feel, but very good chance that it could impact your glucose control as well. So that link is down below. It gets you 25% off. So check them out after this video. Wow, this one's really wild. Okay, so the second meal effect is this effect of a meal prior to the next meal impacting your glucose and insulin resistance. What that means is what you eat for breakfast can significantly impact how your lunch reacts. What I mean by that is if you eat a breakfast that's going to have a high glycemic carbohydrate in it, that can impact how you respond to your lunch and even your dinner. So believe it or not, it's not just about what's right in front of you, it's about what you ate beforehand. So what do you do with that? Well, one of the biggest things that people can do is protein preload their day. We have strong evidence that when you protein preload the meal prior, it can reduce the area under the curve of the following meal significantly with glucose. So that means you can make a good decision in the morning, low glycemic carbohydrates, high protein, high fiber, and that will change significantly how you end up using glucose and ultimately your insulin sensitivity the rest of the day. When I stopped thinking about how will I respond at literal just every meal in the moment and started thinking one step ahead, it's the lowest hanging, biggest lever that you can pull. So if you can change your breakfast, you can change your glucose impact by 30 to 40% with the next meal. That is way easier than micromanaging every single meal all the time. The next thing that I learned is that insulin resistance, fatty liver, and visceral fat all live under the same roof. They all work the same way. A lot of times fatty liver is caused by insulin resistance and vice versa. And then high levels of fatty liver and insulin resistance lead to more visceral fat accumulation. More visceral fat leads to more inflammation. Inflammation leads to more insulin resistance. So we can see how visceral fat is a poorly managed like glucose and metabolic issue that we can definitely do something about. So in order to kind of coin Dr. Sean O'Mara on this, he recommends periodic time restricted feeding. He recommends fermented foods for visceral fat. He recommends periods of sprinting and avoiding sort of long duration endurance work because that's extra stress on the body. Focus more on sprints and focus more on high intensity work. And of course, those periods of time without food that are really important to restore that sensitivity. I learned in the first few years of getting rid of insulin resistance that if I was deficient in magnesium, some of my symptoms would come back. The reason is that magnesium helps regulate what's called autophosphorylation of insulin receptors. This is basically saying that our insulin receptors don't work well if we're deficient in magnesium. So magnesium helps influence our receptors to be more sensitive to insulin, allowing us to control our glucose better. If we can do that, then we can allow our bodies to use glucose better, and all those insulin dynamics start coming back into check. Number 11, I noticed that insulin resistance with a lot of people that I talk to can quite frankly be corrected shockingly fast. Like, we can see huge improvements in insulin sensitivity in just short periods of time with time-restricted feeding, periodic low carbohydrate diet, with obviously the implementation of exercise, but realistically, like, huge changes in insulin sensitivity with just like 4 or 5 days of intermittent fasting or time-restricted feeding. You can't make this stuff up. I mean, independent of calories in, calories out, the fact that you're taking a break from food allows your pancreas to get a chance to reset. Number 12 is that doing things to improve your sleep is oftentimes the best short-term fix that you could possibly find. And let me spin it another way. When you're sleep deprived, it can make insulin resistance 20 to 40% worse in that next day, literally. Okay, we're talking serious things here. So improving sleep is the short-term literal best thing that you can do, but that's a vague thing. What are some things you can do? 200 to 400 milligrams of theanine, huge impact on kind of making the brain a little bit calmer and increasing the affinity for serotonin, so you feel a little calmer. 3 to 5 grams of glycine. Glycine helps you fall asleep and stay asleep, okay? It does this through multiple different mechanisms, but it also helps relax your bladder in a way that you're not getting crazy signals that you have to get up and pee, which is a very powerful thing if you're someone that has to wake up in the middle of the night to pee and then can't fall back asleep. Another thing that you can try is 20 to 30 milligrams of a saffron extract. Okay, we're seeing that this has an ability to increase serotonin as well, helping you feel more calm and tilting that GABAergic state, getting you out of that sympathetic tone so you can be a little more relaxed. Number 13 is red light therapy actually works. I was resistant to doing it for a long time because I thought it was interesting for circadian rhythm and stuff, and I'd use it from time to time, but from the metabolic perspective, it just didn't click. Until now, we're seeing more and more research on how it influences what's called cytochrome C oxidase, which is complex 4 in the mitochondria. That is a fancy way of saying it helps the electrons from fuel get through the mitochondria and turn into actual energy better. Not only that, is we're learning through a lot of quantum biology and interesting stuff that the mitochondria are photosynthetic organelles. They respond to light. So when they get the light, they actually use fuel better. Now, this is not random woo-woo science. This is very real stuff. There is a huge metabolic effect with red light. So yeah, that's something where, wait a minute, if I'm getting adequate amounts of sunlight, adequate amounts of red light, I can influence how my body uses carbohydrates and, more importantly, just uses fuel. Because remember, insulin resistance isn't just a carbohydrate issue, it's a fuel substrate issue. As a matter of fact, even just gaining weight and being overweight in the first place, you could argue is a fuel partitioning issue. The body doesn't know how to regulate which fuels to use. But we're also now seeing that red light can help GLUT4 translocation. So after a high carbohydrate meal, it can actually help get the translocator to pull the glucose into the cell where it needs to be. So it helps you literally get glucose into the cell. Number 14 is one that people may or may not like, but it's one that flat out works for me, and that's methylene blue. The reason that methylene blue works in people that are potentially metabolically dysfunctional is because it allows electrons to sort of get through the different phases of the mitochondria that I would ordinarily have trouble doing with dysfunctional mitochondria. So it's an electron donor and electron carrier. You eat food, the electrons come into the mitochondria, and methylene blue helps them get through all the way so you can actually turn it into energy. What this potentially does is it kickstarts the mitochondria into using fuel again. You don't want a bunch of dead, decrepit, dying mitochondria. You want active mitochondria. Think of it like a jumper cable for your mitochondria in so many ways. The last thing that I've learned, and honestly it's the most recent, is that carbohydrates oftentimes aren't even the cause of insulin resistance. They are a side effect. Having an issue with carbohydrates is a side effect of the insulin resistance. And we need to be able to train the body to use carbs too. If you go long enough without carbs, you're just going to be forever insulin resistant because your body's going to have no enzymatic or survival reason to use carbs in the first place. Now, if you decide that you never want to have carbs again, that's fine. But accept the fact that that's going to be the story that you write for yourself. And what I mean by that is if you go to Thanksgiving and you have a slice of pumpkin pie, you're going to have a very hard time dealing with it, and you're going to feel like garbage. And if that's what you like and you want to keep completely low carb all the time, I mean this sincerely, have at it. I know lots of people have done it and I've done it. But the reality is you also need to train your body to use carbs because that way, when you do have them, you're not having the symptoms, you're not having the bad feelings of insulin resistance. You want to train your body to use them so that it knows how to use both fuels. Now, I did a video kind of like this where I talked about like what I would do differently if I was 300 pounds again. And I think that's a really good video for people to watch because it's not so much about insulin resistance as it is just about what I went through to drop weight. And that's a very helpful video. So I put that one right here. As always, keep it locked in here on my channel. I'll see you tomorrow.